A pristine suburban neighborhood on a sunny afternoon, where perfectly manicured lawns stretch as far as the eye can see. Among these immaculate properties stands one house with an unkempt yard, its wild grass dancing in the breeze. The owner, Mrs. Thompson, peers through her curtains, watching a middle-aged man methodically working in her garden. She doesn't recognize him, and suspicion clouds her judgment. Her fingers tremble as she dials 911, reporting a suspicious person trespassing on her property. What she doesn't realize is that this simple call is about to unravel a story that would leave her questioning everything she thought she knew about wealth, appearances, and prejudice. The man in question is Michael Chen, though most people in the neighborhood just know him as the gardener. For the past 15 years, he's been maintaining yards in this affluent community, always arriving in his weathered pickup truck, wearing worn work clothes, and carrying his trusty tools. But today, something's different. He's working on Mrs. Thompson's yard without her knowledge, a favor for her elderly neighbor who noticed her struggling to maintain the property after her husband's recent hospitalization. As police sirens wail in the distance, Michael continues working, seemingly oblivious to the commotion he's about to face. Little does Mrs. Thompson know that the man she's reporting owns a multimillion-dollar landscaping empire, with contracts spanning 3 states. His weathered appearance and modest demeanor mask a success story that would make any entrepreneur proud. The responding officers arrive, their cruisers casting rotating blue lights across the manicured hedges. What unfolds next is a lesson in humility that would shake the foundation of this quiet suburban community. As they approach Michael, one officer recognizes him immediately, not from any police record, but from a recent feature in Business Weekly magazine. The truth about Michael begins to surface. His rags to riches journey from a small-time gardener to a self-made millionaire who never lost touch with his roots. Despite his success, he continues to work alongside his employees, believing that true leadership means getting your hands dirty. His company employs hundreds, provides scholarships for employees' children, and contributes significantly to local community projects, including the very park where Mrs. Thompson takes her daily walks. But here's where our story takes an unexpected turn. As the police officers explain the situation to both parties, Mrs. Thompson's face flushes with embarrassment. Yet Michael's reaction isn't what anyone expects. Instead of anger or resentment, he offers a response that would leave a lasting impact on everyone present that day. The incident quickly becomes the talk of the neighborhood, spreading from house to house like wildfire. But the real story isn't about wealth or mistaken identity. It's about something far more valuable. As Mrs. Thompson stands in her doorway, watching the scene unfold, she's about to learn a lesson that money can't buy, and Michael is about to reveal why he chose to keep his success a secret for all these years. What happens next would not only change Mrs. Thompson's perspective forever, but would also spark a transformation in the community's understanding of success, judgment, and the true meaning of dignity. But that's just the beginning of this remarkable tale. As Mrs. Thompson watched the police officers talking with Michael, her mind raced back to earlier that morning. She had been preparing her usual cup of chamomile tea when she first spotted him through her kitchen window. The sight of an unfamiliar figure in her yard had instantly triggered memories of recent break-ins reported in the neighborhood newsletter. Living alone since her husband's hospitalization had made her more cautious, perhaps overly so. The sound of laughter now drew her attention back to the present. One of the officers was sharing a friendly handshake with Michael, their conversation animated and respectful. Mrs. Thompson's neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had emerged from her house and was now walking toward the group, her face bearing an expression that mixed concern with gentle amusement. "Sarah," Mrs. Chen called out to Mrs. Thompson, using her first name with the familiarity of someone who had lived next door for over a decade. "I should have told you earlier. I asked Michael to help with your yard. I've known him for years. He's not just any gardener. He's the best in the business." As Mrs. Thompson stepped hesitantly onto her front porch, the weight of her mistake began to sink in. The man she had reported to the police was now engaged in a detailed discussion about sustainable landscaping practices with the officers, his knowledge and passion evident in every word he spoke. His weathered hands gestured expressively as he explained the importance of native plants in maintaining a healthy ecosystem. The truth about Michael's success story began to unfold like the petals of the roses he had just finished pruning. 25 years ago, he had started with nothing but a borrowed lawnmower and a dream. Every weekend, he would maintain yards in this very neighborhood, saving every penny he earned. While other young entrepreneurs chased quick profits in tech startups, Michael had chosen the patient path of building something sustainable. His first big break came when he secured a contract to maintain the grounds of a local business park. Instead of pocketing the profits, he invested in better equipment and hired his first employees. He paid them well above market rate and treated them like family. Word spread, and soon his small operation began to grow. But success hadn't changed Michael's fundamental approach to life. He still drove the same kind of truck he started with, though newer models were now part of his company fleet. He still worked alongside his crews several days a week, believing that true leadership meant understanding every aspect of the business from the ground up. As Mrs. Thompson listened to his story, shared not by Michael himself, but by her neighbor Mrs. Chen, she felt a deep sense of shame mixing with growing admiration. Here was a man who could afford to live in any house in their upscale neighborhood, yet chose to remain in his modest home on the other side of town. A man who had built an empire but still found joy in the simple act of helping a stranger in need. The police officers were preparing to leave, their initial suspicion transformed into respect. One of them mentioned having seen Michael's company trucks around town, maintaining parks and public spaces. "Your team did an amazing job with the children's playground downtown," the officer commented, to which Michael responded with a humble nod. Mrs. Thompson finally found her voice. I owe you an apology," she began, but Michael raised his hand gently to stop her. The expression on his face wasn't one of anger or resentment, but rather understanding and compassion. He had something to say, something that would reshape not just Mrs. Thompson's perspective, but the entire neighborhood's understanding of success and dignity. But before he could speak, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down to reveal a face familiar to everyone who watched the local news, the mayor himself. He stepped out of the car, walking toward the group with purpose. It seemed Michael's story was about to take yet another unexpected turn, one that would reveal why this successful businessman had chosen to keep his wealth a secret for so long, and how this incident would catalyze a change that would ripple through the entire community. Story continues with further development of characters, exploration of themes around prejudice, wealth, and community, while maintaining suspense and building toward the next segment. The mayor's arrival created an immediate stir in the quiet suburban street. He approached Michael with the familiarity of old friends, revealing that they had been working together on a major city initiative, one that would soon transform their community in ways no one expected. Mrs. Thompson watched as Michael and the mayor engaged in an intense discussion, their voices too low for others to hear. The police officers remained, their presence now seemingly more out of curiosity than duty. Mrs. Chen stood beside Mrs. Thompson, quietly filling in the blanks about Michael's countless contributions to the community that had gone unnoticed and unnamed. The children's hospital garden, Mrs. Chen whispered, that was him. The downtown park renovation, the school playground, all anonymously funded. Each revelation felt like another weight on Mrs. Thompson's conscience, but there was clearly more to this story than simple philanthropy. The mayor pulled out a folder from his briefcase, spreading documents across the hood of his car. Michael's expression grew serious as he studied the papers, occasionally glancing at Mrs. Thompson's house. The neighborhood had been struggling with development issues, corporate buyers attempting to force out longtime residents, property values skyrocketing beyond reach of ordinary families. Suddenly, Mrs. Thompson's phone rang. It was the hospital. Her husband's condition had taken an unexpected turn. As she struggled to maintain composure while listening to the nurse, she noticed Michael watching her intently. The mayor, too, had fallen silent, his expression unreadable. The gathering crowd of neighbors grew quiet as Michael stepped forward, clutching one of the documents from the mayor's folder. He seemed to be wrestling with a decision, one that could change everything. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn he had just finished tending, and in that moment, the true purpose of his presence in Mrs. Thompson's yard began to emerge. But before he could speak, another car pulled up. a luxury SUV with tinted windows. The atmosphere shifted as a well-dressed woman stepped out, her presence causing Michael to grip the document tighter. She was known to everyone as the representative of the corporate development firm that had been buying up properties in the neighborhood. The tension in the air was palpable as she walked toward the group, her heels clicking against the sidewalk. Michael stepped forward to meet her, the mayor close behind. The next few moments would reveal why Michael had maintained his secret for so long and how this apparent case of mistaken identity would become the catalyst for something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. The corporate representative, Ms. Porter, strode forward with a confident smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Chen," she said, "I believe you're interfering with our plans for this neighborhood." Her words hung in the air like a threat, causing the gathered crowd to shift uncomfortably. What happened next sent shockwaves through the assembled group. Michael pulled out his own folder, revealing documents that showed he had secretly been buying up properties throughout the neighborhood, not to develop them, but to protect them. For years, he had been operating through various shell companies, outbidding corporate developers to keep longtime residents in their homes. Mrs. Thompson's phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from her mortgage company. Her hands trembled as she read that her home was facing immediate foreclosure, something she hadn't shared with anyone since her husband's hospitalization had drained their savings. The timing couldn't have been worse. Ms. Porter seized the moment, producing a purchase offer for Mrs. Thompson's property. "We can solve all your problems right now," she said smoothly, extending the contract. But Michael stepped between them, his weathered hands gripping a different set of papers. The mayor stood beside him, nodding gravely. "There's something everyone needs to know," Michael began, his voice steady but charged with emotion. Just then, a group of his employees arrived in their work trucks, each carrying boxes of documents. Among them was his youngest son, a successful attorney who had been working behind the scenes on something much bigger than garden maintenance. Mrs. Chen gasped as she recognized one of the documents being distributed. The true scope of Michael's plan was finally coming to light, but so were the forces aligned against him. Ms. Porter's pleasant demeanor cracked as she made an urgent phone call, speaking in hushed but angry tones. The mayor stepped forward, ready to make an announcement that would change the neighborhood forever. But before he could speak, Mrs. Thompson received yet another call from the hospital. This time, the news would force everyone to choose sides in a battle that had suddenly become very personal. Mrs. Thompson answered the hospital call with trembling hands. Her husband had awakened and was asking for her. As tears welled in her eyes, Michael stepped forward, revealing the true purpose of his presence. The documents in his hands weren't just property deeds. They were part of a community trust he'd established, designed to protect vulnerable homeowners while preserving the neighborhood's character. "Mrs. Thompson," he said gently, "your neighbor told me about your situation weeks ago. The work I'm doing here isn't just gardening. I'm documenting the historical significance of these properties." He explained how his company had been secretly gathering evidence to have the neighborhood designated as a historical district, which would prevent corporate developers from destroying its unique character. Ms. Porter's composure completely crumbled. The documents Michael's son was distributing revealed that her development firm had been using illegal practices to force residents out of their homes. The mayor confirmed that an investigation was already underway, and Michael's meticulous record-keeping had been instrumental in exposing the truth. But the biggest revelation came when Michael explained why he'd maintained his humble gardener persona. "My father was a gardener in this neighborhood," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He taught me that true wealth isn't about what you own. It's about what you protect and nurture. Every property I've bought has been placed in a community trust. The residents can stay in their homes, paying only what they can afford." Mrs. Thompson learned that her mortgage troubles were already being handled through the trust, not as charity, but as part of Michael's vision for sustainable community development. The foreclosure notice she received was the corporate firm's last desperate attempt to force her out before the historical designation was announced. As Ms. Porter retreated to her car, defeated, Michael's employees began unloading gardening equipment. They weren't just there for show. They were beginning a community-wide restoration project, funded by the trust, to help restore and preserve the neighborhood's historic character. The mayor officially announced the historical designation, and Michael revealed one final surprise. He had purchased the abandoned community center at the end of the street, and his company would be transforming it into a training facility offering free landscaping and property maintenance courses to local residents. But just as the celebration was beginning, Mrs. Thompson received another call. This time it was her husband himself, and what he had to say would add an extraordinary final chapter to this already remarkable story. Years ago, he had done something that would connect his family's fate with Michael's in a way that nobody could have imagined. The gathered crowd fell silent as Mrs. Thompson's expression shifted from shock to wonder. Her husband had been one of the first people to give Michael's father a chance, hiring him as a gardener when no one else would. That simple act of kindness had set in motion the events that would, decades later, save their home and their entire community. Michael smiled, finally understanding why Mrs. Thompson's address had seemed so familiar when Mrs. Chen first mentioned her situation. "Your husband's kindness changed my family's life," he said. "Today, I'm just continuing the cycle." As the sun set on this extraordinary day, the neighborhood had been transformed not just by the legal protections now in place, but by the revelation that the most powerful acts of community building often come disguised in the humblest packages. Mrs. Thompson's mistaken call to the police had unwittingly exposed a story of generational kindness, strategic philanthropy, and the triumph of community over corporate greed. The following days brought remarkable changes to the neighborhood. Mrs. Thompson's husband returned home to find their garden flourishing under Michael's care. The community center renovation began immediately, with locals volunteering alongside Michael's professional crew. Former adversaries became partners in preserving the neighborhood's unique character. Mrs. Porter's development firm faced legal consequences for their predatory practices. The investigation revealed similar schemes in other communities, leading to broader reforms in property development regulations. Michael's documentation had protected not just one neighborhood, but potentially many others. The story of the millionaire gardener spread beyond their community, inspiring other successful business people to invest in preserving affordable housing. Michael's community trust model became a template for similar initiatives across the country. Yet he continued his hands-on work, believing that true leadership meant staying connected to the earth and the community. Mrs. Thompson became an active volunteer at the community center, sharing her own story with families facing similar challenges. The center became a hub for both practical education and community organizing, helping residents understand their rights and maintain their historic homes. Each weekend, Michael could still be found tending gardens throughout the neighborhood, now accompanied by apprentices learning the trade. His son expanded the trust's legal services, providing free assistance to communities facing similar development pressures. The neighborhood's transformation wasn't just physical. Residents who had barely known each other became close friends, sharing meals in their restored gardens and organizing community events. The historical designation brought tourism, but more importantly, it brought pride and stability to longtime residents. A year later, at the community center's grand opening, Mrs. Thompson's husband shared the full story of his connection to Michael's father. His simple act of kindness had inspired a legacy of community service that would continue for generations. The center was dedicated to both men's memory, a testament to how small acts of kindness can blossom into lasting change. Michael's success story had come full circle, proving that true wealth isn't measured in dollars but in the strength of the communities we build. The neighborhood became a living example of how prosperity and preservation could coexist, and how mistaken judgments could transform into powerful partnerships. As sunset painted the sky over the restored community center, Michael stood in the garden he'd created there. Watching residents gather for evening classes, sharing skills and stories, he smiled. The secret millionaire had never needed to reveal his wealth to make a difference. He had simply needed to stay true to his father's wisdom about nurturing growth in both gardens and communities.